Hey, everybody. Today on the Preacher Boys podcast, I am joined by Dr. Laura Anderson. She's a psychotherapist, an author, a religious trauma consultant, and she has written the incredible book, When Religion Hurts You, which I have a link to in the show notes of this episode. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking about what she calls in her book, adverse religious experiences. In the beginning of the conversation, she identifies what trauma actually is, giving a working definition for you to apply in your own conversations. And she also lists some adverse religious experiences that she's noticed has affected some of the clients that she's dealt with who have experienced religious trauma. It's a really helpful conversation, and I hope you'll really appreciate it. Here's my conversation with Dr. Laura Anderson. Laura, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited for this conversation.
Yeah, you've been on my radar for a minute now, and I'm glad we're finally connecting in an official way.
Yes.
Not too long ago, but
Yes.
I wanted to bring you on to talk about a few topics, but the one I wanted to talk to you about today was all of your research on adverse religious experiences. And
Yes.
I think for a lot of people who've done a little bit of research on trauma, they probably are familiar with ACE, which is adverse childhood experiences.
Mhm.
Why did you think we needed a category specifically for religious experiences?
Yeah, so that answer is a couple different facets. The first one, adverse childhood experiences, was seminal work. It's stuff that we still refer back to today. It was so important, and it really gives the clinical community and even people outside of the clinical community a way of understanding people's behaviors, especially as it comes to trauma, when they didn't have quote unquote something big happen to them, a car accident, being in war, things like that. So the work that they did with the ACEs study was incredible and groundbreaking. And it's used in like schools and things like that, but it's not often recognized in a diagnostic sense. Also, the adverse childhood experiences study really breaks down these adverse experiences into 10 different categories. And the hypothesis is that the more or the higher you score on the ACEs, kind of leaderboard, the more likely it is that you will have a diagnosis of developmental or trauma or CPTSD. They have now since recognized that those 10 things are probably pretty limiting. They probably need to go back and add more to it. But when my colleagues and I came up with the term adverse religious experiences, or AREs, we really liked what the ACEs study had done. And so we wanted to piggyback off of that. But what we quickly realized is two things. First of all, there's way more than 10 AREs. There's way more adverse things that can happen in religion that may result in trauma than just 10 things. And we didn't want to be the determiners necessarily of, oh, this is adverse or this is not. We wanted to leave it open to people to be able to determine for themselves, hey, these were adverse religious experiences to me. And we still kind of operate off of the hypothesis that the ACEs study has, in which we would hypothesize that the more AREs you have, the greater the likelihood that it would result in religious trauma. But that's not to say you could have one ARE and it result in trauma, or you could have 100 AREs and it doesn't result in trauma. So we're trying to make it very open. The other piece of that phrase, the reason why it's so important, we believed, is because up until that point, the term that most people had been using is spiritual abuse. And that can be a very visceral term. It's something that it feels very strong. And a lot of people shy away from using that term because they say, no, 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 no. Like, I wasn't abused by a clergy member, or these really extreme things didn't happen to me. So certainly it can't be abuse. And then they're left with this kind of question mark of like, well, what was it then? Because if it wasn't abuse, but it was still bad, like, was it really bad? Like, was it really that bad? And so we wanted to create a term kind of that felt a bit more accurate to what people were describing, and that they could use to help organize what their experiences are. Now, one might say, yeah, you're just talking about spiritual abuse. And sure, that might be that might be a possibility. But truly, we wanted that term to be able to give to people, just to have a greater amount of language to organize and understand what their experiences are.
Yeah, no label is going to be all encompassing. And I think
Right.
this is one of the debates I think I see in what would probably be more your circle, is that there's people who are very strongly against pathologizing at all and like
Yes.
labeling anything because
Mhm.
of subjectivity, unique experiences, context.
Yes.
And then there's people on the other end that go the other extreme where they want to label and organize everything. And
Yeah,
that's the way of trying to make sense of really horrific things.
of
And I think
course.
there's
Yes.
helpfulness somewhere in the middle.
Mhm.
And I think that giving people vocabulary is a
Mhm.
helpful and important
Mhm.
thing, especially when, like you said, spiritual abuse is such a loaded phrase. And
Yeah.
there's people
Yeah.
I've noticed that I've talked to who are no longer religious who go, I don't even know what that would mean, spiritual abuse. Like,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and then there's other people who don't like the word abuse. But if
Mhm.
you say, was it a negative impact or was it adverse, effects on you? They would say yes. So, um, with this as a framework, I want to really quickly also define trauma,
Mhm.
because trauma is a word that gets thrown out all of the time. It's a buzzword
Yeah.
in 2024 and 2023 to say, I experienced trauma from
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
What does trauma mean for
Mhm.
sake of this conversation?
Yeah. So, for sake of this conversation, we're looking at trauma is not the thing that happens to you, but it is the response of your body and nervous system to
Mm,
the thing that happens to you. Typically, we're looking at trauma as anything that's too much, too fast, too soon, that overwhelms your ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. And so, in that, inherently, then we know trauma is very subjective. What is dangerous or traumatic to you may or may not be for me, and vice versa. And it's perceptive, meaning that there doesn't actually have to be a real threat in front of you. Our body can perceive danger and threat,
hmm,
and that can result in trauma. And also, trauma is embodied. It does not just live in our minds. We cannot think it away. It lives in our body, and therefore we resolve it in our bodies. And that is important because prior to really like this discussion becoming public, people would say, okay, this thing happened to me, so therefore I am traumatized. And
hmm,
to be fair, the clinical community was in on that as well. There was a very long time where they really viewed trauma as specific events that happened to people. And
yeah.
we're looking at things that are catastrophic, very much out of the ordinary, like sexualized violence, like war, like natural disasters, car accidents, witnessing death, things like that, all of which could absolutely be traumatic. But they were reserving them only for these what we would call out of the ordinary events that are happening in life.
I may have heard you say this. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but wasn't there in like training, wasn't it dealt with as like trauma and crisis? Like, isn't that the way it was structured for a long time?
Mhm,
Was we're dealing with like basically a horrific event,
mhm.
and it was very event focused. Like, I forget where it was
Yeah.
labeled that, but it was called trauma and crisis, which put it all into this like one little bucket, which
Yes.
doesn't sum up all experiences.
Yeah. So, what most people outside the clinical field don't know, and when I say clinical field, I mean like psychology and therapy. Like when we are in our programs getting this training, we get at best one course that is about trauma. And it's almost always a trauma and crisis course. And within that, the focus is on crisis. And within that, typically the way trauma is defined is by the old ways of definition, so that it is a thing, it is an event, it is catastrophic and out of the ordinary. That's what trauma is, and we don't really touch on it too much. So when you now look around and you see therapists and psychologists and coaches that are trauma trained, that means that they went out on their own, spent their own time, their own money, because these trainings are ridiculously expensive. But they said, no, like we need to be prepared to handle trauma. So we're going to go out and get the extra education to do it. And so I always think it's important for people to know that, because simply going to a therapist does not necessarily mean that they are equipped to help you navigate through the resolution and recovery of your trauma.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Mhm.
Well, now that we've laid the structure of what AREs are, and we've
Mhm.
laid the structure for what trauma is in light
Mhm.
of this conversation, in your book, When Religion Hurts You, which if anybody's listening, they should go grab a copy right now, you list out five examples of adverse religious experiences. And like I said, it gives vocabulary, but also it felt like a checklist where I was going, yep,
Mhm.
down the
Mhm.
list. It's by no means exhaustive, but I thought it'd be helpful to go through the 5 that you list
Mhm.
and kind of explain how that shows itself in a lot
Yeah.
of cases, and what are some ways to kind of work through those experiences and
Yeah.
categorize things that, maybe when you're having a conversation with someone outside of a religious world, they don't even know
Mhm.
what you're talking about, or maybe you're
Yeah.
struggling to find a therapist who understands this.
Mhm.
Giving some just practical ways to kind of process really, traumatic teaching, or really negative teaching
Mhm.
that's helped impact and mold you, maybe from the time you were born till the time you graduated your Christian high school or your Bible college. So,
Yes.
or when you turn like 50 and you broke out of religion, like wherever
Mhm.
you are on that spectrum, I think this would be good to talk about. Um, the first one you list is fear of hell or eternal conscious torment.
Mhm.
How are some ways that you've seen that affect maybe clients that you've worked with, or
Mhm.
just in the study you've done? What are some ways that kind of shows itself in ways later on?
Yeah, so we see this a lot with people in extreme amounts of anxiety. There's a
Mhm.
term called religious scrupulosity, which really
Great
is
word.
a diagnosis. It is under the umbrella of OCD. And so we would consider it like a religious
Mhm.
OCD. So that is obsessions and compulsions with religious practices in order to be good or saved or make sure you're doing it the right way. We see this a lot with the eternal conscious torment and
Mhm.
hell piece because of course that ultimately could, if we didn't do these things, we ultimately could, land in hell in most of these religions. And so there's a lot of focus on performance, making
Mhm.
sure to do things right, say things right, believe things the right way, follow all of the rules. And so that's where we get a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of anxiety, like I said, religious scrupulosity or religious OCD, and then a myriad of other mental health disorders, relational struggles, things like that, anything connected to trauma. But it can create a lot of disconnect in relationships as well, which can lead to
Yeah.
loneliness and isolation. It can become a great sense of fear and mistrust with other people, a lot of self doubt and lacking of self trust because, okay, did I really like pray the prayer? Did I really do these things? I'm doubting myself,
Mhm.
a lot of shame and guilt that are going along with these things too. And so, from a clinical standpoint, that there might not be diagnoses for all of these things, but we can easily see, okay, so we have this belief that for many of us, we have never experienced a time where we haven't known this,
Yeah.
of like, hey, you're going to burn in eternal conscious torment without your family unless you do those things. And you're hearing it from a parent, somebody who is supposed to be loving you, protecting you, nurturing you, keeping you safe. And you have this parent or authority figure telling you, like,
Mhm.
here, this is what's going to happen to you. Oh, and I love you. And to then we start to conflate those things with one another. And of course, that's where we also start to see some of these adverse impacts throughout the remainder of our life in a lot of cases, because there's many people too that even coming out of religion, they are still grappling with that fear and
Mhm.
shame and doubt, inability to trust. And I know this sounds kind of funny, but it's very true and common, which is why I think it's important to bring up. We call it rapture anxiety.
Mhm.
And of course, we many of us probably dealt with it while we were in religion. But this idea of like, I walk into my house and
Mhm.
nobody's there when they're supposed to be there, and like, oh shit, did the rapture happen? Right. And there's still so many people that I work with and talk with on a daily basis that say, oh, I left those beliefs behind. But that is the first thing that I think of when I don't hear back from this person, or when I walk into a place and these people aren't here, or it's a little too quiet, or anything like that. And so that's very real too. And we can chalk it up and be like, oh, that's kind of funny, but that comes from a real fear response.
Right. I love the Freudian slip where you said left those beliefs behind. A little left behind
Yeah.
insertion there. Um,
Oh
but
yes. Yeah.
I, yeah, all of what you're saying, again, it's one of those things where I'm fascinated by the effect of being taught from the time you're like earliest memories are being formed, like even things prior to memory, like when you're learning the sky is blue and don't touch that, and
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
those things you're learning as a kid, you're seeing pictures of Jesus, you're learning stories about heaven and hell and concepts that, adults argue over and spend time racking their brains over, and you're
Yeah.
expected to kind of get it, and I,
Yeah.
and you mentioned, yeah, it's kind of funny to look at, like, we've all seen the pranks in our religious upbringing where someone lays clothes out on the couch and convinces their friend that the rapture happened. But then you also hear the flip side of that story where people go like, "Oh, I broke down crying because I was terrified that really happened."
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that's really kind of helped me have empathy as I've listened to people in different religious environments,
Yeah.
is that no matter how bizarre the belief may seem, if it's real to you, it affects
Yes.
how you behave and the
Yeah.
decisions that you make.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to go look at a Scientologist or someone
Right.
in a religion that we tend to think is out there.
Yeah.
But then we start reflecting on our own experiences and
Mhm.
going, well, we believed very strongly about this event happening that, we don't need to be worried about.
Yeah. And I think like, you briefly mentioned a few moments ago kind of there's different arguments to be made for like
Sure.
terminology and diagnosing, but I think the reason that I personally and professionally struggle with people saying things like, religion causes trauma or this belief is
Mhm.
trauma or things like that is because that like the trauma actually isn't held in the belief. It's in how your body, your nervous system responds to that. Because like you just said, we can look at somebody in Scientology and we're like, "Oh my gosh, how do you believe that? That's
Right.
laughable." Like it's not scary. But that's because we didn't grow up in it.
Yeah.
For them, that belief that they hold is the equivalent of like my belief in hell or the
Mhm.
belief in hell that I had. And so I think that's why for me it's really important to distinguish what trauma is, because like religion is not inherently traumatic. The belief of hell is not inherently traumatic, but it certainly can lead to trauma because of the way that that can live in our body and the inescapable nature of it, or who's really drilling that home to us, or what the consequences are. And I think that's important to recognize. If hell was inherently traumatic, then technically every person who's ever heard of hell should be traumatized, and we know that's not the case. So
Right.
I like to be careful with that.
Yeah, I'm curious too, like I mentioned just a second ago, like from the time you're a little kid, you're being
Yeah.
taught this. And I think most of
Mhm.
my listeners come from at least a young age. Like the majority I hear is my parents freaked out because they had kids and they put us in Christian school at 5, or they were born into the church. Like that
Mhm.
is a very typical
Yeah.
experience. Um, so I know for me, I'm at a spot now. I have no idea what I believe when it comes to religion at all. But I know for me, like the default operating system is informed heavily by religious upbringing.
Mhm.
And I'm envious of people I talk to who go, that doesn't make any sense. I can't even imagine thinking
Yeah.
in a default way that way.
Yeah.
But for me, when my mind wanders, it goes straight to,
Mhm.
you're going to hell, you're
Yeah.
doing that. Like that
Mhm.
is my kind of subconscious way of thinking.
Yeah.
When I'm
Mhm.
objective and I'm thinking and my brain is functioning and I'm actively going in a certain direction, that stays off to the side. But how do you begin kind of rewiring that operating
Mhm.
system that has that buzz in the background all the time that's
Yeah.
telling you something that you were programmed to think is just as true as
Mhm.
the sky is blue, the grass
Right.
is green, so on
Yeah.
and so forth?
Yeah, well, it really is about rewiring. And I think what's
Mm.
really important to know, like if you look on social media, you hear all of these people saying, I had to unlearn this, I had to
Yeah,
unlearn that.
right.
And, call me crazy, but I'm going to get really technical. As it comes to neuroscience, we do not unlearn anything. When we have learned it, we have learned it. It doesn't just disappear from our memory. And I think that's important for people coming out of high control religion, because we can often shame ourselves for like, why do I still go to this thought? Why can't I stop thinking about this? Why, when I think about this, does my body have this reaction? And what I would say is because your brain and body are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And so when we look at like how do we navigate this now that we've left a system like this, we really are looking at needing to have new lifestyles, beliefs, actions, relationships that we're intentionally putting into place and engaging with more than the old messages. Now, I believe those are well-worn grooves. Like when we've been in it for 20, 30, 40 years, like
Right.
those are well-worn grooves in our brain. And our brain and body works together to create physiological signals and sends chemicals to all different parts of our body to have these very specific reactions. And so it's important to know that because those will never go away, but they can be weakened. There's a saying that it's called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together, which means the more you do something, the more likely it is that that thing will happen again and again and
Mm.
again. And so we would want to then, work with that belief or that action or that relationship or whatnot to do some reprogramming, not deprogramming, reprogramming of what we learned. And so that would be developing new habits. So it would be developing a sense of self awareness, catching ourselves. There's some other like memory trips and ticks, what do they call them? Tricks and tips that you can employ to do that with music and hypnosis and
Yeah.
things like that. But we really are looking at beginning to become aware of what's happening and trying as soon as we become aware to shift maybe our thoughts or actions, give ourselves a different internal physiological experience. And then the other piece of that is really offering ourselves a lot of compassion for when those old thoughts and habits pop up seemingly like unexpectedly. That's not a defect in who we
Mm.
are. It doesn't mean that we still are all about that thing. It just means that that is where our brain and body has been trained to go. And so, we just need to notice that and
Mm.
shift over into the new.
Yeah, love that. Before we move on from this topic, I know that there's many people, even on my own show, my audience is very diverse in terms of people that are religious, non-religious. I very much from when the last time I polled was like very close to 50-50 of people
Mhm.
that hold to I'm religious or I'm not religious at all.
Yeah.
For the topic of hell specifically, it's a heated topic for lack of a better word. And there are people who believe in a literal hell, who
Yeah.
believe that I love people, so I'm going to constantly warn them and talk to them about hell. And so it
Mm,
creates a really frustrating dynamic, I think, for someone who doesn't hold to that belief, who's
yeah.
constantly being hit with, you should believe it because,
Mhm.
it's you're going there, so that's the conversation you're
Yeah.
having. How should someone deal with maybe a friend, family member who is constantly waving that flag in front of them
Mhm.
saying like, hey, watch out, and they're well
Mhm.
intentioned, because it's harder to tell those people like, hey, shut up and
Mhm.
go away,
Yeah.
like how do you kind of balance that out or encourage people to have those conversations?
Yeah. Well, I think so much of change happens through relationships.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily happen through shaming other people, yelling at other people, telling them they're wrong, things like that. I think it's where we can lean into compassion and empathy. There was probably a time where we believed just as fervently in the messages that they were teaching, and we
Yep.
weren't telling other people about it because we wanted to control them, but
Yep.
it was because we so deeply believed them and wanted them to be in eternity with us or
We
spend
forget
eternity.
that all the
Yeah,
time, that we
yeah,
used to have those beliefs. I think
yeah,
I'm glad you said that.
yeah. Yeah, and I found that when we can lean into that, I always say fundamentalism is a coping mechanism for a dysregulated nervous system, which I
Mm,
feel like is a very compassionate way to look at other people. So when we have these fundamentalist ways of thinking and relating, and now we're putting them on other people, all that is telling me is that that person is probably living in a lot of fear and hypervigilance,
yeah.
and they are trying so hard to just stay alive and survive according to their belief system. That gives me a lot of compassion, and it also kind of dissuades me from
Sure.
wanting to fight, right?
Right.
So that's not to suggest that we just sit and listen all the time. Sometimes that is, we can do that, but
Right.
there might be other times where we do need to set some conversational boundaries, such as saying like, hey, I understand this is something that's so important to you.
Mm,
I think it's actually best though if we don't talk about it. For our relationship, the way that we're going to be able to stay connected is if we kind of table certain topics
mm,
and stay away from those and kind of focus on this other thing over here. Sometimes it could be kindness and listening and just letting them, talk about things without chastising them or challenging them. Other times, depending on the person or the location, you might ask if you could share your own experience or
mhm,
feedback or, education or whatever it might be. It's really going to depend on the relationship.
right.
But in my experience, when we offer empathy and compassion, there is a much greater likelihood of change and curiosity than when we fight back. Um,
Mm,
and so that would just be kind of my suggestion, if at all possible. Now, I want to just one quick caveat on that is I know, especially when we are coming out of these systems, it can feel deeply triggering
mhm,
to be in the presence of somebody talking about something that you once believed and even caused a lot of pain in your life, and they're still championing it and telling you that you're wrong for not believing it. And
right.
so in that case, it may be very appropriate to kind of redefine what that relationship is. Maybe that means stepping back for a little bit. Maybe it means like saying, "Hey, I will connect with you on the football game and that is it." Or something like that, where we really do have to look at redefining that relationship for a little while so that you have time to develop things like internal safety and, resolve trauma, recover from things and whatnot, and then reconsider how to engage in that relationship.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I think relationships are everything. And I think also like expectation of conversation makes things easier. I shared an article like 3 days ago about, and then a couple months ago, I shared something kind of similar. But I've had a couple, ironically, like in the last few months, I've had people that have just randomly come up to me that are like witnessing for whatever religious denomination they're in.
Mhm.
And my response to those conversations has been instantly like, oh, my palms are sweaty and I want to
Yes.
run out of here and this is
Mhm.
miserable.
Yeah.
Same thing. I ran into a very popular conference speaker from when I grew up at
Yeah.
the airport out of nowhere. And the minute I saw him, my
Of
hands were like
course.
shaking, you know? And
Yeah.
I'm sitting in the terminal, like putting sriracha on like my breakfast burrito, like my hands like shaking everywhere. And it's like, it's funny
Oh,
because in those moments you're like, it
yeah.
feels so sudden and
Yeah.
unexpected. You don't have time to prepare. Versus, I
Mhm.
think having a
Mhm.
friendship or relationship where you know their intention, you
Yeah.
know the context, and you're prepared for the conversation seems
Mhm.
to make it a lot easier to put yourself in that mindset versus getting
Mhm.
confronted, which I think is where most people find themselves. Is it's
Yeah.
Thanksgiving dinner and they're turning to you. You
Yeah.
know, it's the
Yeah.
rough spot.
Well, and the other thing too is just because somebody asks a question does not mean you have to answer it.
Yeah,
In these religious systems that we're coming out of, there is a lot of expectation that you can ask other people extremely private information and expect an answer, and that it's okay to challenge their answer if they don't give the one that you
yeah,
like. And so part of that is, again, we can offer empathy and compassion, right? Because there was a point where we probably did that too. And so that is a bit of rewiring to say, okay, this person said this or asked me for my thoughts or whatever. I can also gracefully decline. I can say, actually, I don't want to engage in that. Or we can find some other phrases to use to
yeah,
say no. Or we can just say no, like, sorry, not interested in that
yeah.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I've mastered the art of when people ask me because I've had a lot of strangers through the show,
Yeah.
like when I'll post something about like an abuse case that happened,
Yeah.
and they'll go, "Let me ask, are you a believer?" Which I talk about on the show, so they can easily find that. But a lot of times I just respond with, "That's not relevant to what I posted."
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
like I don't.
exactly.
It has nothing to do with this arrest
Nope.
that was just made. But
Yeah.
anyway, we could talk about this.
Yeah.
Each of these could be their own podcast episode. But I want to go to number two, which is something that I'm sure nobody's ever been traumatized by, purity culture.
Yeah.
So, purity, virginity, and abstinence culture.
Yeah.
Um, this is something that, I mean, 99% of people I talk to have said they've been affected in a negative way by.
Mhm.
Um, why do you think purity culture has been so harmful? Again, this could be a whole podcast episode.
Yeah.
And why do you think that it's something that is like a consistent experience across the board, even amid like different denominations, different religious contexts? Like this one
Mhm.
seems to really hit a
Mhm.
lot of people.
Yeah. So I think it's important to note for the purposes of this conversation, we really are talking about purity culture in line with abstinence and virginity. When we look at the history of purity culture, we know there is deeply racist roots. We know that it goes beyond just sexual purity.
Mhm.
But for this conversation, we'll kind of keep it under this under this umbrella. You
There you
know,
go.
'cause
Another
we all
Freudian slip.
we all love our umbrellas. So in terms of like why the impact and then kind of like why do we see this in other religions as well or other systems as well? I really believe that our sexuality is the essence, the core of who we are. And when I say sexuality, I do not just mean like who are we smashing genitals with. I mean like the way that we navigate through the world, how we engage in relationships, how we make decisions, social justice issues, what we're passionate about. That's all connected to our inherent sexuality. And and that is very dangerous for systems that want to control you because that means you're tapping into yourself for wisdom and knowledge and direction and choice rather than them. And so, if we can vilify that part of us, I think that leads it to be easier to control somebody or a whole group of people. Um, I know that that probably could be a much bigger discussion there,
Sure.
but I think that also kind of answers that second or just like why do religions in particular do this? It's that answer. But it's essentially stripping away everybody of their core humanness
Hmm.
and making it putting it under the authority of whatever the rules of that group are. And how can we not be impacted by that?
Hmm.
On an individual level, we think about just the physiological and psychological impacts that can have, but it impacts our relationships. It impacts like generational pieces. It
Hmm.
impacts how we operate in the world. It impacts legislation. It impacts all sorts of different, areas of our lives. And so, in the work that I do at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, we, of the clients that come in, I would say 90 to 95% of them are all working through something related to purity culture and or it pops up in the work, even if that
Yeah.
wasn't what they were coming in for to begin with.
Yeah. I think again, this goes back to things that just go into your default operating system. And like,
Mhm.
because again, so many people are raised with these kinds of teaching.
Yeah.
I've mentioned on the show, like men are taught like, hey, sex is awesome, don't have it, and
Yeah.
don't ask questions about it. Girls are taught like, you're not really interested in sex, you're interested in the emotional side,
Mhm.
like all of the things of, women want love, men want respect, like all
Yeah.
that teaching
Mhm.
um, just falls into the default. But even beyond that, because I think I've talked about that so much on the show,
Mhm.
like the two things that have really, I feel like are underserved in this conversation is men are affected by purity culture teaching too. Because
Mhm.
I think
Yes.
there's things about, cutting off emotion, being taught you're not emotional, being taught
Mhm.
you can't control yourself, being taught like there's
Yes.
so much. And I think it gets glossed over because men on the surface benefit from the system. But the truth is, you're not really benefiting.
Yeah.
You're just not
Yeah.
being outright abused
Yeah.
in the way that many people are who are,
Yeah.
in the female side of this conversation.
Yeah.
You're being trained to be abusive in many
Mhm.
cases.
Yeah.
And again, it may give you more power, but is that something that's beneficial to a fulfilling life?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a single man I've worked with or talked to that has come out saying, "Yeah, purity culture was actually really beneficial for me."
Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, then a lot of times the amount of shame. Well, I think everybody experienced shame and a huge amounts of it just in different ways, like
Mhm.
coming from different places. But the amount of shame that I hear from the men that I've talked to, it's astronomical. I mean,
Mhm.
they are scared of themselves. They are feels like they're out of control. They're this sexual animal that is never satiated. And has no control over their body and what their body will do in the presence of a female that, you know, might make them stumble, like
Mhm.
it's just, it's so much. And I grew up with male siblings, so I felt like I actually have a pretty balanced perspective of like the impact
Mm.
um, on men as well as my lived experience as a woman. And I really remember, and obviously purity culture, high control religion taught me to think like this, but
Mhm.
I really thought at the time men had it way worse because they just were
Mm.
so visual and they couldn't help themselves and they were lusty creatures and like all these things. And I was really convinced like it is my job as their sister and then as
Mm.
a sister in Christ to make sure that I did whatever I needed to do, whether
Yeah.
that was change the way I talked or walked or dressed or how I did my hair or who I interacted with, or even dumbing myself down, silencing myself so that I wouldn't be too threatening or intimidating or smart. I wanted to make sure I was doing everything that I could because these men had it so hard and I didn't want to be the thing that was making it more difficult for them.
Yeah. That's so much pressure. And it's something that, again, I mean, it's it's undue pressure on both sides. But I think one of the things that you're kind of leading into is like the way you view yourself in these systems from
Mhm,
the female side. I mentioned the male side,
mhm.
but from the female side, I just interviewed Alice Gretchen.
Oh,
That
yeah.
episode should be coming out soon. But or actually, it'll let me rephrase that. That episode came out already when this episode
Awesome.
is out, and so people can go listen to that. But I
Yeah.
know in her book,
Mhm,
she gets very detailed about that experience and talks
mhm,
about, modeling for the first time and seeing pictures of herself and
mhm,
all of the thought processes of, one, to even start doing that career
mhm,
felt like it's a violation of everything I was ever taught, and that I'm completely, you know, giving myself over to a horrible lifestyle.
mhm,
But then the part that really hit me is when she gets her first photos back and she had this moment of like being disassociated from the experience of going, who is this person? Like, this
mm,
person is
mhm,
beautiful. This person looks this
mhm.
way. That can't be me
Yeah,
because I'm not supposed to look like that.
yeah.
And I think that, again, there's so much self-worth that gets affected when you're saying, like you said, I have to dumb myself down. I have to
Mhm.
look a certain way. I've talked to women who literally got in trouble in college for having wet hair because people
Yeah,
might think, oh,
they were just in the shower.
yeah, oh,
Yeah,
I'm thinking about them in the shower now. And
yeah.
it's like, it's these bizarre things that
Mhm.
shouldn't even be part of your day to
Yeah.
day thinking.
Mm-mm.
Um, how do you go about working on the self worth side of things when you've been
Mhm.
objectified from the time you're a little kid and
Yeah.
by family, by friends, by pastors? Like, how do you go about becoming like an actualized person that can go like, this is me, this is what
Mhm,
I like to wear, this is who I like to be, this is how I
mhm.
like to talk, and I'm smart. I'm going to let myself be smart. Like, how do you go about embracing that and reclaiming that?
Yeah, so I consider purity culture a form of sexual abuse.
Hmm.
I know some people think that that's a really extreme way. I'm very careful to differentiate. I'm not calling it sexual assault. Sexual assault is a specific act that happens against somebody. It's an act of sexualized violence. But when we look at abuse and what that is, I believe purity culture falls under that. It is misusing our sexuality for an unintended purpose. And so I say that because I think that can help us frame like those questions, like how do you heal? Like how do
Hmm.
you get some of this back? Because what the research actually does show is that the impacts of purity culture are hand in hand with how somebody is impacted by sexual assault. And that is researched.
Hmm.
Like that when people have experienced like the teachings and practices of purity culture and maybe they leave it, their physiological embodied responses and the way they interact with themselves, the world, and other relationships is almost identical to how sexual assault survivors navigate the world as well. And there's research to back that up.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The amount of shame, the amount of, I mean, at the very least, there's a lot of grooming within that,
Right.
within that
Yeah.
world. And
And yeah.
I was going to say, someone recently was on the show and she was talking about she was saying like, I feel like everybody in our denomination was groomed
Oh
with the way
yeah.
that sexuality was taught.
Yeah.
And some people were pretty upset about that statement, but I think that's
Mhm.
100% right. Like
I do
when
too.
you're hearing preaching about, hey, your infant daughter should not wear sleepers because it looks like pants, like
Yeah.
one, the immediate question I have as a parent now is like, who the heck is in the room that's like
Yeah.
stumbling over this thought? Because we should deal with them. And
Mhm.
the other piece of that is like from an early age, you're being taught like you are a piece of meat to be bought and sold. You're owned by
You're an
your dad. You're
object.
to be
Yeah.
sold off to your
Yeah.
husband. Like
Yeah.
if that's not grooming, I don't know
Mhm.
what is.
I would completely agree with you. And so I think it's very important then that we actually look at purity culture using those words and those terms and the physiological symptoms that arise from that, because not only does that accurately describe the experiences, it also leads us towards the healing pieces of it.
Yep.
What are the interventions that we can use? Like I don't need to go create a new sexual trauma therapy for purity culture survivors. I can already
Mhm.
use what's out there.
Sure.
Um, and it shows the validity of like, yep, what happened really was that bad. And I think it just gives us a wealth of resources out there to be able to work with this. And I think then kind of going back to the beginning of the purity culture piece is like, because it's all encompassing, of course it encompasses the self-worth piece. I think, as we get back into our bodies in healthy ways, as we learn that, like, not only do we have a body, but our bodies are good. And, like our sexuality is
Mm.
good. Like, that's how we can then start to branch out and really figure out, like, who am I apart from these things that happened to me, or these beliefs and practices that I had, or potentially the trauma that resulted from all of this.
Right. And even more so when someone is sexually abused physically
Yes.
in coordination with that teaching, which is
Yeah.
I'm encountering a lot where, they were already taught to be ashamed. They're already taught all these things. They're already taught if you lose your virginity,
Mhm.
which that whole terminology, it's such a harmful thing. And then so you have people who are raped or sexually
Yeah.
assaulted who are going, okay, well, now I'm not even pure. Like
Yeah.
there's layers of that.
Yeah.
And that ties into now more fear of hell. Like there's so many layers to this stuff that I think is so horrific. And beyond that,
Yeah.
just like again, the fact that you can't wear a pair of pants without feeling slutty,
Yeah.
like because that's the way you were taught. It's a mess to unwind all of that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
What are some resources that you found? You mentioned like you don't need to go create a whole new resource. There's resources out there. What are
Mhm.
some resources that people should check out for this conversation?
Yeah, the one that I think is probably the most accessible is a book by Peter Levine called, oh gosh, I think it's called Sexual Healing. um,
Okay.
and it is for people who have endured sexual assault, sexual abuse, things like that. It is only available on audiobook, which I actually prefer because he has a
Sure.
very soothing voice and he leads you through exercises. The reason I always choose that book as a resource is because it is full of information. So he does help you understand what is happening in your body and why it is that you're having these responses, like what
Mm.
sexual trauma does to you, like the psychological pieces. But then he also gently leads through exercises that help to get you back into your body, that help to help you to be able to create your body as a safe place to
No.
be. And so it's really, laying the foundation. Now, obviously, if everybody could work with a body-based trauma resolution, practitioner, that would be ideal. But I
Mhm.
do know that sometimes that's not feasible for a variety of reasons. So that is the direction that I tend to point people in when there just aren't the resources, or we're just tiptoeing into this and we don't know if we want to like give our time and money to that. I also think Hillary McBride's book, Wisdom of the Body, can be really helpful in this case
You
too.
beat me to the punch on that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so
Yeah.
gentle, as is, Hillary. I mean, it's like you can hear Hillary's voice through the words as you're reading them.
She's
Um,
someone I recommend Audiobook
Yeah.
if possible.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. So Peter Levine is like the male version where he just really has that very inviting, warm, comforting voice.
Hmm.
And there's like a sincerity and kindness behind it, which I think is true of Hillary as well. And so I would say like those two books are really great because it again it gives you the informational side of it, like the education side, but then it also leads you through some very gentle practices to start getting you back in your body, which really is the foundation for any sort of trauma
Hmm.
resolution. Yeah, that's where I would
No.
start.
Oh, great. So when I write a book, I'll have Peter Levine do the audiobook so people don't have
Yes.
to hear this for 9 hours straight, you know? Um,
Yes.
uh, Number three that you have is altar calls,
Mhm.
healings, scary sermons. This is
Mhm.
something that for anybody in the independent Baptist world, the altar call was every single
Yes.
Sunday, every
Yeah.
service.
Yeah.
You're down the sawdust trail, as Billy Sunday would have said. Um, I think this is something that really it ties into the last two, which is I remember tearfully laying with your head on the carpet, crying, so you don't want to go to hell. I remember
Mhm.
in the purity culture side, this is one of those things that's like I can laugh now to keep from crying about it, but it's like I remember in high school, like I remember like I was watching porn and I
Mhm.
remember
Mm.
going to church the next Sunday
Yes.
and yes, I am going to hell. There you go. But I remember going for a couple Sundays, I would be at the altar and I'd be like, I keep doing it. I keep messing up.
Mhm.
And I remember literally praying like, if you need to take my
Mhm.
eyes, if you need to blind me so I don't do this again. And
Yeah.
it's such a crazy thing to say now, but the sincerity
Mhm.
in that then
Mm.
after hearing emotionally charged preaching
Yes.
and
Yeah.
music playing just as I am 35 times, it's a
Mhm.
really crazy
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
I think the one I want to focus in on this is the way that this has shown itself is that I constantly second guess if I'm experiencing the same thing others are experiencing.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I know altar calls were a common thing for that. Like, am I
Mhm.
experiencing healings are like this? Like, people in the Pentecostal world probably have this
Mhm.
story where people are seeing this move of the Holy Spirit on them. I'm
Mhm.
sitting here in my pew going, I'm not feeling it. Do I walk the aisle? Or they are feeling it and no
Mhm.
one else is. And
Yeah.
so what are some ways you've seen kind of
Mhm.
this experience affect different people? And what are the lasting impacts of kind of these emotionally charged experiences?
Yeah, well, I think what I'm hearing you say kind of boils down to self-doubt, like, I can't trust
Yeah.
myself. I
Yeah.
don't have resources inside of me that lead towards wisdom or
Hmm.
insight that I can use and apply to a situation, and I
Right.
think in a lot of ways, that's what those are all about. They're asking you to actually disconnect from yourself, from your life, from your body, and place it in an external authority, or, system or set of
Put
rules.
yourself on the altar, which in biblical language, which we never talk about, is literally putting you in the place of the sacrificial
Lamb, yeah.
lamb or,
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
that's such a crazy
Mhm.
visual. Like the
Yeah,
fact that you are going and putting yourself, which even like theologically, like doesn't make much sense, but
right.
yet here we are.
Yeah. And so what's happening during those times is there is like, okay, there's a reason why music is accompanying those.
Hmm.
Music gets you into specific brain space that allows you to be more susceptible to various messages, especially if they're repeated over and over and over, whether that's on the same day or many days or many months and years. Like that helps with it. And what you're being told is there is something wrong with you, and we have the answer. We can fix you so
Hmm.
long as you do these things. I know that's like simplifying it way down, but
Sure.
that's essentially what that is. Like, we don't need an altar call if we're inherently good. We don't need, to be saved again if we're not totally depraved. And so I think that's a big thing to just consider, and why they can be so scary is it it takes whatever your actual lived experience is and says that's actually not right. And you cannot trust yourself. And the only way that you can essentially survive this world and the next is by doing these things, saying these things, believing these things, and giving us your full control. And we're going to put you in a situation that's highly emotionally charged
Hmm.
to get you to do that, to get you to make decisions that you may not make if that were not the case. And then that kind of gets our hooks in you, and we can do that over and over and over to a point where you they don't even have to say anything. They just play that chord on the piano and
Yep.
you're guilty and ashamed.
Yeah. There's Sadie Carpenter, who does the Leaving Eden podcast. She talks about Jack Scott at First Baptist Church of Hammond. Like literally, the design of the auditorium was the floors in the auditorium were slanted downward, so people would
Mm,
move down the aisle faster to get to the altar, and it would make them go up slower back to their seat.
mm,
So it was all like very strategized and planned
yeah,
out.
yeah.
And I think that's something that is funny when you talk about the more fundamentalist groups, is they'll point to the charismatic world or the
Yes.
Pentecostal and go, they're so emotional, they're so this. And I'm
Yeah.
like, if you sit in an altar call where they're playing Here Am I or Just As I Am, it is
Mhm,
just as emotionally charged, and it's all the same.
mhm,
You're susceptible because you're in this trance-like state
mhm,
to do what they want.
mhm.
And I worked with an auto group for a little while doing marketing, and so I sat in on some of the sales trainings with the sales guys at the car dealerships. This
Yeah.
is relevant. This is not just a
Yeah.
random
Yeah.
aside. Here's my job description. But one of the statements that's always stuck with me is one of the sales trainers said, people make decisions with emotion and they justify with logic. And I
Yes.
think so many people's, that's talking about buying a car,
Mhm.
but I think a lot of times in religion, it is that thing.
It
There's
is.
that emotionally charged moment in which you sign the contract, you
Mm,
pray the prayer, you do the thing, and then you
mhm,
start learning apologetics, and then you start learning philosophy, and then you start going to Bible college and doing your 1 year Bible program, which turns into
mhm,
4 years of Bible college. And you're justifying this emotional conference decision with all of this logic that makes that moment okay. And
mhm,
I think I would encourage people making any decision, whether this is leaving a certain thing, whether it's
mhm,
staying, is like, make the decision separated from purely just the emotional
mhm.
response.
Yeah.
Like, if you're sitting there and you're sitting at your desk and you're reading through a book and you're going through it logically and you make a decision, that's one thing. I would
Mhm,
say, if you're making one in that mode where you feel that fight or flight, like I need to run
mhm.
to the altar or I need to do this, like it's
Yeah.
probably not the best state of mind to make a life
Mhm.
altering decision,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
just my perspective. I
Yeah.
don't know if you co-sign that.
Well, I mean, I would say like emotions are pieces of information. It's
Sure.
just that, and they are valuable and they can help us make decisions and lean in different places and ultimately, kind of walk the path that what of whatever we want to.
Hmm.
But they are just that. They are pieces of information. They are not facts. They are not, completely true all the time for me, for eternity, or for anybody else. They are simply the color that we can add into
Hmm.
any given situation that helps us make decisions that are of the highest value from ourselves. And that oftentimes means we need to slow things down. We need to tune in. We need to
Hmm.
not make rash choices. I'm talking like big life stuff. Like if you need
Sure.
to choose between like coffee or tea, do whatever you
Right.
want. You
Yeah.
know,
Follow your heart.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, they're pieces of information, and we're often not taught that in religion, but they often use and exploit the emotional piece to get you in, and then they use the logic piece to keep you in.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, okay, number 4 here, spanking and corporal punishment. This is something that is again a heated topic.
Yeah.
I think even people culturally, like, this is a.
Mhm.
I mean, just the fact that there's research showing negative side effects of this is relatively
Yes.
new, culturally speaking. So you're going to constantly get comments. I'm sure I'll get some on this video where, my parents spanked me and I came out fine, or that kind of
Sure.
rhetoric. Um, why did you feel the need to include this within these top 5
Yeah.
religious adverse experiences?
A couple things. First of all, you are correct. There is absolutely zero research to date that suggests that physically assaulting your child through spanking or any other form of corporal punishment is beneficial and, kind of achieves the greater desire, the greater goal. There's no research that backs that up. And there is research, in fact, that backs up that if you are in these situations of being spanked and corporal punishment, the greater likelihood that you may inflict that upon other people, meaning like adults, actually does go up. So there's the science piece of it.
Just making sure I heard you correctly. It ups the chances that you'll get as an adult who carries out corporal punishment. You're more likely to get into physical altercations with other adults.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes. Now, it doesn't mean you absolutely will, because there's
Sure.
many of us who have
Here
been
come the
spanked,
comments. I've never
right?
been in a physical altercation with an adult. I only beat up kids. It's
Yes,
only them.
exactly. Yeah. And so I think that's part of it too, is when we look at this from adult to adult, right? So if you and I have an argument or you do something to cross me and I say, you know what, Eric, that's it. I'm going to hit you. I'll spank you in a non-sexual way, right?
So purity culture, we're going to
Yeah,
go back to that.
exactly. But if I did that,
Yeah.
that would be considered physical assault, and I
Mhm.
could likely be given jail time or some other sort of legal punishment as
Yeah.
a result of doing that to you. So then why are we doing that to kids? Kids who have no way to escape that, who are not bigger, stronger, wiser than their parents, and who are completely dependent on their parents to love them, support them, provide for them, take care of them, protect them. And we're saying, and oftentimes in religious situations, we're saying, I'm doing this because I love you. And so then the kid is going, oh, so physical assault means love. Okay,
Mhm.
they're not able to determine between good assault and bad
Sure.
assault, right? Because there is no difference. It is assault. And so we're also then, and this is also backed by research, we are also then increasing the chances of that child growing up into an adult and being more susceptible to that physical assault through abuse, whether it's physical abuse or other forms of abuse, because of what they've learned and experienced in their home and believing that abuse equals love. I cannot tell you how many clients we have had to work through that those two things are not the same. And it's heartbreaking when they're 40, 50 years old going, wait, what? I didn't know there was a difference between them.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious for I was reading Reza Aslan's book, God,
Yes.
and one of the beginning parts of the book was him talking about if you ask a kid to draw a picture of God, they're going to draw a picture of something that looks close to their dad, like
Yes.
9 times out of 10. It's going
Yeah.
to be a a masculine figure that represents probably the masculine figure that they have in their life, their dad or the dad-like figure.
Mhm.
And I think this is where it ties into spiritual abuse too, is I think many kids are getting taught by their dad growing up in religious circles that, because I was lucky in terms of, I was spanked
Mhm.
here and there.
Mhm.
But I would say, not quite severely at all as some of the
Mhm.
friends that I had where it was
Sure.
constant. It
Yeah.
was a pretty rare thing. But I know, there were people that I was around who were, experiencing a dad that wasn't a loving figure whatsoever.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I can say I had a dad that was very loving, tried to explain things, spent a lot of
Mm.
quality time. Like,
Mm.
nobody's perfect, but I
Sure.
knew my dad loved me. And I know I had
Yes.
friends where they did not know that. And I know I
Mm.
had friends who had wait till your dad gets home. And
Yes.
dad was the
Yep.
judge, jury, and
Yep.
executioner.
Mhm.
And then you back that with the teaching you're getting about your holy father, your
Mhm.
God the Father figure,
Mhm.
and he looks like an abusive jerk like your dad.
Mhm.
Like, your view of God, the world, the way your life
Mhm.
plays out, like the amount of shame, fear, anxiety that not only do you have your physical father who's going to physically hurt you, you
Yeah.
have a spiritual father who's going to eternally hurt you. Like,
Mhm.
all these beliefs just stack and stack and stack
Yes.
on each other. And I'm curious, like, do you find that for people that you work with, their view of God being the judge over
Mm.
them is kind of the sugar that helps the medicine go down when it comes to the temporal,
Mhm.
physical kind of abuse they may have experienced from the hands of their physical, earthly father?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. When
Yes.
I'm
My
when
favorite thing ever when I'm doing a podcast. I've never been asked that. I'm like,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
there it is.
So my gut inclination is maybe. What I hear most often is that what makes it more palatable to deal
Hmm.
with is that we have these phrases of God disciplines those he loves. You know, the verse that I don't even think is actually a verse of like God doesn't give us more than we can handle, which
Yeah, I
isn't
don't
a
think
verse,
so.
but people quote it as that. um, or spare the rod, spoil the child type thing, where they will look to the Bible and or the biblical responses or excuses that their parents gave them to
Mhm.
say, okay, if God disciplines those he loves, if those who follow God suffer and hurt, I'm hurting a lot, I'm suffering a lot, I'm being disciplined a lot, that actually must mean that God loves me. And that must mean that I have favor.
That's twisted. Yeah.
Very twisted, very twisted. Um, and yet I have heard that. I have
Mhm.
personally believed that
Mhm.
from so many people. Um,
Yeah.
and then we also have the honor your father and mother thing. And so there's like sometimes this blind trust that goes along with them. So if our parents are in that position of authority and they're doing that to us, and God punishes those he loves or whatever, it's not too far of a jump then to really say, well, then my parents are loving me as well.
Hmm.
And I mean, I know before I could really comprehend like the spiritual truths and sin and whatever, I knew that I was supposed to honor and obey my parents. So I
Hmm.
knew that if I was disobeying them, it meant I was disobeying God.
Hmm.
Right. And so the parents are kind of that like interim piece that are carrying out kind of God's will or punishment or whatever. And then also supposed to be these image bearers of love. And so I think that's where we start to then embody, abuse equals love. And, God must really love me if he's allowing me to
Hmm.
suffer this
Yeah.
much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, number 5 is, and like I said, these all stack. We could have done these in any
Yes.
order, and there's
Yep.
some context, but
100%.
number 5 really speaks to what we've talked about through each point, which is these
Mhm.
power imbalances that exist between
Yes.
men and women, between kids and their parents, between
Mhm.
the saved and unsaved, between
Mhm.
the people who are experiencing the spirit and not experiencing it, or experiencing conviction and not experiencing blessing
Mhm.
and not experiencing it. If I repeat like another phrase, I'm going to sound like a pastor. There we go. But this last one, patriarchy and oppression. Patriarchy's been a hot button phrase.
Mhm.
But I want to speak a little bit broader just to oppression in
Mhm.
general
Mhm.
and to groups that have not held power historically within churches.
Mhm.
Because again, like I don't like the comparing of trauma and don't like the comparing of
Right.
experiences because it's not helpful and you can't help but live the experience that you experienced.
Right. Yeah.
However, speaking for myself, as a straight white guy in the church, I'm well
Mhm.
aware that there are people who've had experiences far more severe or at least different
Right.
than the ones I experienced.
Mhm.
And I guess speaking into that, like when we're having these conversations, I know for me as a host, having these discussions, I'm sure for you as an author, it's
Mhm.
terrifying trying to write something that's going to be helpful to
Yeah.
everybody
Mhm.
broadly
Mhm.
because of the diversity of that experience. But
Yeah.
how do you see power imbalance really affect people? And what are some ways we can make, obviously the environments we're leaving are not, they're not helpful for people who are in a different
Yes.
class than we are.
Mhm.
How do we make the conversations we're having now as we talk through deconstruction and religious trauma? How do we make sure those aren't gatekeepy and weird and, we're excluding the stories of entire groups of people as we
Mhm.
have these conversations?
Yeah, I think I say it in the book. Within patriarchal systems, nobody wins, not even the people at the top,
Exactly. Yep.
right? And so I think that's important to recognize, because what you said was so important, of just like, hey, this was my experience, and
Mhm.
and I can acknowledge that other people may have experienced something entirely different,
Mhm.
which could have led to more significant impact, or more long lasting impact, or whatever that may be. I'm a big believer that comparison in these areas only leads to shame.
Mm.
Either myself feeling shame or somebody else feeling
Yeah.
that shame. And so I think, in these systems of power and control, there is always this jockeying for position
Yep.
of, whether it's who's more in power and who in control, or who had it worse and deserves
Yeah.
the resources, or,
Who's the most
whatever it might be.
traumatized is the most bizarre conversation to
Right,
have. Yeah.
right. And yet that's how our world is.
Mhm.
We assume that. And so when I go like, okay, so what do we do with that? We ourselves have to learn how to like take a breath, and to recognize that somebody else's experience, whether it is better or worse or whatever than yours, doesn't invalidate your own.
Mhm.
Like, and that's where we, as a culture, I think we have a hard time with that. But I think if we want to be like really brutal, you're right, somebody does always have it worse than us. Like,
Mhm.
there will always be that.
Yeah.
But that does not invalidate what you have gone through, the hand of cards you were dealt, the system you grew up in, or anything like that. And so I think, in coming out of those systems, we often grab hold to what is the same and familiar and similar, and we
Mhm.
call that safe. And part
Yep.
of coming out of those fundamentalist systems and like disembodying how fundamentalism lives inside of us is being able to grapple with difference. And that means
Mm.
difference of experience, difference of characteristics, difference of belief, difference of cultures, ethnicities, genders, sexuality, letting ourselves lean into the difference, and
Mhm.
to realize that that is not dangerous. We are just all doing the best we can in a lot of cases. And being different than somebody is not a threat or danger, but it's actually what like colors the world.
Mhm.
It's what makes relationships vibrant, and it makes things exciting, and it gives passion.
Yeah.
But we're not used to that coming out of these systems. And so that's far easier said than done, but that is something I do find to be quite important.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like just keeping in mind that allowing other people into the conversation
Yeah.
isn't minimizing
No.
your experience. It's just
Yeah.
broadening the conversation and acknowledging the
Yeah.
legitimacy of their experience. And I
Mhm.
think there is, I mean, we're default fundamentalists. We are tribal by nature. We like to find our group and our people and our clique,
Mhm.
and we find security in that. But I think, again, someone having an experience where they were groomed and talking about it does not minimize the experience of someone who was assaulted and
Right.
experienced the physical ramifications of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it doesn't, we don't have to, that's the thing, is like, at the end of the day, we don't have to have one be worse than the other. They're all pretty
No.
bad.
Yeah.
Where we can talk about each
Yeah.
in context,
Yeah.
and we don't have to insert ourselves in a
Yep.
conversation that's not ours.
Yeah.
That's
And
not
I
our
think,
dialogue.
even logically speaking, we could say, well, so what if you had it worse than I did? Like, what does that
Yeah.
actually mean? So,
Yeah.
okay, so I should have one less therapy session, or,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and so I think even logically we can come from that to say that it literally does nothing for us to
Yeah.
compare that. But what does do something for us is to lean in with curiosity and compassion and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
Mm.
I wish that had never happened to you. You did not deserve that." And then we can turn that back towards ourselves as well, because we are deserving of hearing that and knowing that deeply in our bodies. And that, I think, is very opposite of fundamentalism.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been very helpful. I think each of these five, like I said, could probably be a book.
Of course, yeah.
And there are books on each of these topics, but I think every one of these could be their own episode, their own series of episodes, their own podcast. Like, there's so much here.
Mhm.
But I appreciate kind of walking through these. There's something
Yeah.
that when I was reading your book, I was like, well, this is just a section here of gold to give
Yeah.
somebody if they're reading 2 pages of the book. these are probably the two that I would recommend they
Oh,
read.
thank you.
But thank you for walking through these. For anybody who's listening to this episode, be sure to grab a copy of When Religion Hurts You. There's a link to it in the show notes of this episode. For someone who's picking up a copy, do you recommend they
Mhm.
pick up the audiobook or the paperback for your book?
Oh, that
We've talked about
depends.
Hillary McBride's book. I want to know what you
Yeah.
think about yours.
Well, I did narrate my book, so that's kind of fun. What I have heard, the feedback that I've gotten from most people is that they have to go through it quite slowly, and
Mhm.
oftentimes they highlight a lot,
Yeah.
which you can do in audio versions as well. I think there's a
It's
way to
not
do it or
it's not a
something.
perfect system. I've tried
Yeah.
highlighting in audiobooks and I hate the way it sorts stuff
Yeah.
out. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So personally, like I think the paperback copy is nice because you can just highlight as much as you want. But for people who tend to be more auditory learners, I think the audiobook is great. And that was a really just speaking as an author, that was a really cool experience to
Yeah.
have it to hear your book in a totally different light and be like, oh, this is why I wrote it. Wow,
Yeah.
there's actually a kind of some cool things in there, you
Yeah.
know?
This book's pretty good. Wow. Well, yeah, we'll
Yeah.
definitely go check it out, the audiobook or the paperback.
Mhm.
I recommend the paperback for this
Yeah.
one just because there is a lot of underlining you're going to want to do. But
Mhm.
be sure to grab a copy. And I look forward to seeing you on a future episode.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.